Today, I am excited to be in conversation with Elissa Teles Munoz, who is the K through 12 Programming Manager for Climate Mental Health Network, a youth mentor and ally, climate education specialist, and project manager. At Climate Mental Health Network, Elissa manages partnerships to engage educators across the country and coordinates a multi-phase project to support middle school teachers in addressing climate emotions. Hi, everyone. I'm joined here by Elissa, and I gave a little introduction, but I would love for you to be able to introduce yourself in whatever way feels right to you in this moment.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Elissa Teles Munoz. Um, I think my age is relevant, is the first most relevant thing. I'm 24. I graduated from college about 2.5 years ago. And while I started working in college, I got really involved in the climate education space. And so since then, I would call myself a climate education specialist and now have really started working in the climate emotions and climate anxiety space with respect to climate education. I'll also add that I'm a youth mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. And where in the world are you located right now?
Right now, I'm located in Miami, Florida.
Miami, which I know as we've talked, that has definitely influenced your relationship to climate and
Definitely,
health.
definitely. I think what I can say about that is I grew up in the Northeast, and
Hmm.
I think that, and I moved here this year, kind of unexpectedly. And so I think that climate has been and my involvement in climate since I was in college has been one of the biggest culture shock issue areas for me, having moved here, especially with respect to education and climate education.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and imagine, you know, me being like, for example, from LA. There's definitely more of an open and welcome conversation around those things. Um, and I would imagine you have to kind of tiptoe around a lot of barriers.
Yeah, definitely. And it also just doesn't seem to be a priority or something that anybody thinks about. Maybe people aren't outwardly outspoken against it, but it's just not at the top of mind.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas it's always at the top of my mind.
Same, same. Absolutely, yes. And thank you for mentioning your age. I realized I'm like, oh, I don't know if the other participants mentioned their age, but that is very relevant. You are firmly a Gen Zer. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I'd say so.
Okay. Okay. I always, because I'm like 96, and I don't know. I feel like personally, I kind of feel like these divisions are arbitrary.
So arbitrary. So it
So
also depends if
arbitrary.
you grew up oriented toward your older siblings or younger siblings, or did you have siblings?
Exactly. Yeah. And then when you really get into like, okay, why are these different kind of generational divides made? It was like all due to marketing and
Totally.
capitalism, and it all ties into that, which we'll get in with our conversation on climate and mental health, as it's all connected. But I would love to begin with just a few kind of grounding questions around climate change, which in this moment feels even controversial to say the term climate change. But what does climate change mean to you? And what is the problem of climate change? And I think by this, I was saying earlier to you that oftentimes we are asked and talk about our feelings around climate and our anxieties around climate, but I've feel like we're less so, asked like how do we understand what climate change even means and how did we come to understand it in that way? Because I know for me, like my relationship to climate change and what it means and is telling us and how it affects my mental health really shifted when I learned that climate change is not just CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's an expression of all these systems and values in our world. So I would love for you to speak on that and also, the ways that it's changed since when you were younger to now.
Yeah. So I I have here one of my favorite books with respect to this issue area. It's called Teach for Climate Justice: A Vision for Transforming Education by Tom Roderick. So I'll definitely reference
Mhm.
here. I learned about global warming when
Mhm.
I was about 7 in 2007 for the first time. And I remember that my mom described it to me. And I had this image of like street lights and street lamps like melting, like everything was melting.
Mhm.
And I
Like
was,
Salvador Dali style.
yes, literally, that's exactly what I was imagining. And I got so anxious about it. And I remember I had like a moment of like youth, like young child anxiety and panic. And my mom is like, I remember her being like, I'm so sorry. I told you about that. I shouldn't have said
Mm.
anything. Forget what I said. I'm so sorry. You weren't ready to hear that. And then I kind of just have kept that moment in my back pocket because I didn't really have a relationship to nature as a child.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not placing blame on my parents. They don't really have a relationship to nature either. Um, I liked to go to the park, but I saw the park more as like not valuing nature for what it was offering me in its intrinsic right. It was more
Mhm.
like the playground is at the park, and I like to play at the playground, and I like to climb the tree. It was just, this is of use to me, therefore I enjoy it. It wasn't that I enjoyed walking and hiking and discovering little animals under logs. I actually really felt uncomfortable doing that. So
Mhm.
I didn't connect like global warming to nature until much later in life. Um, and so, yes, this conversation of global warming persisted. And then when I was in high school, whatever the year is my age. So, in 2016, when Trump was, came into the
Mhm.
spotlight, the environment was not an issue that I really cared about or understood.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand what was really at stake. This was also the same era as the Dakota pipeline.
Mhm.
Again, I just really didn't care. I found anthropogenic issues to be much more interesting and of concern to me. And I kind of saw it as mutually exclusive to care
Mhm.
about one thing over the other. And so,
As in like humans and environment were very kind of separate in
yes.
your mind at that point.
Yeah, and it's also like there's issues that were to me so much more pressing, like gun
Mhm.
control was the issue of my time. I grew
Mhm.
up in Connecticut, and so there was a mass shooting there. And in high
Mhm.
school, I led our walkout. And it was a very important issue to me. And I was like, people are actually dying like right now because of this. So
Mhm.
I'm going to put all my mental effort into caring about this versus like the environment, whatever that means. Um,
Mhm.
and I remember that I had this friend at the time who um, I was very outspoken in high school. I was just telling Rachel before this that my superlative was most outspoken. Um, and so, when Trump was ascending to power, I was like, this is messed up. This is
Mhm.
crazy. This is absurd. And it was still like taboo and awkward in our high school to care about things and to be outspoken about stuff. And I'm like, no, 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 no. This is just unacceptable. Meanwhile, my friend like was kind of more apprehensive, didn't really get into the whole outspoken part, except when the town wanted to cut down a tree whose roots were actually blocking the road.
Mhm.
She went to town hall to protest it. And I was like, how dare you go to town hall to protest a route that's like actually causing harm to people when actual people are dying. And I found that so insulting. And it's because I really didn't understand the intersectional nature of
Mm-hmm.
climate. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't get it. And it wasn't until college that I got it. And so I started to forge my own relationship with nature as an adult. And still, I am still working on it. It's an area
Mm-hmm.
that I still feel deeply uncomfortable with, and I feel like I talk a lot of talk but don't walk the walk. However, I care deeply about the deterioration of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that to me is what climate is all about, is the deterioration of nature, not as it serves us as human beings, but
Mm-hmm.
as it serves the living beings and non-living beings that had nothing to do with contributing to their own deterioration. That's
Mm-hmm.
all. I won't even use the word fault, but like it's kind of like development theory that one country develops at the cost of another country's underdevelopment. It's the same way. Like the human species thrived at the expense of all other species. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a justice issue at its core. And once I started to understand like justice in terms of racial justice, intergenerational justice, interspecies justice is when
Mm-hmm.
I really started to understand what climate change actually is. That it's not just the carbon cycle that you learn in science class. It is the manifestation of all systems of oppression that human beings and beyond endure.
Mm. That was a beautiful definition there. Um, yeah, oh, I have so many points coming to mind. One that I read recently, and I want to start kind of shifting my language to, instead of saying underdeveloped countries, to say overexploited
Yeah.
countries. I really appreciated that shift. And I think your story talking about how your relationship to nature and climate has changed, and how you're still working on that relationship. I think that's so important to kind of acknowledge, because I think oftentimes as like as an action, like as a climate and environmental action, we're told like, go outside, or like form a relationship to nature, right? But it's like, what does that actually look like and mean is
And also,
not
you don't have to have a relationship, like a physical relationship with nature to care about it. In the same
right.
way that you don't have to have, it's the same argument that people say, like when you should care about women's rights. Well, you have women in your life. No, that's not why you should care about women's rights. You should care about it because women are people and they matter. Same thing with nature. Like, you shouldn't care about it because of your personal relationship to it. You should care about it because it intrinsically has value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, if we're expanding our definition of nature environment to not just be like the green forest over there, but it's actually like each space we exist in is its own ecology. Like even this room that I'm in, it's like we can start from there even. It's just like, I think it's just having a deeper kind of intentional conscious awareness of like how we're in relationship to what is around us, really,
Absolutely.
But and I just I really think the story that you shared is so important for two reasons. And one is because humans are changeable. Like our ideas and our relationships are changeable as we grow and learn and interact with new new places and new issues. Like I just think sometimes we forget that we're allowed to change our perspectives, and that our ideas that we're holding right now may not be the idea we hold tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I feel that that's one of the areas I struggle with in terms of like the political packaging of different issues as
Hmm.
like this is right and this is wrong, and because this is the bucket of things that are right and this is the bucket of things that are wrong, it feels very like inflexible. And yeah, like you can change your mind on things. So anyway, I think that the other part of my story that I left out is the value of education in that journey.
Hmm.
I studied international relations in Washington, D.C. I really wanted to be a lawyer, go into the foreign service, like work for the government, something along those lines is really what I wanted. And then my freshman year of college, I took a course called environmental ethics because there were seats available, because I waited until the last minute, or because I was a freshman, I had the last pick of classes for my curricular that I needed it to fulfill a requirement, basically.
Hmm.
So I was like, all right, ethics is cool, environmental ethics, whatever. And this was in 2018, so it was the same year that the IPCC report with the 1.5 degree of warming came out.
Hmm.
And it was a brilliant class. My professor was Paul Wapner, who's one of the great thinkers in that field, and it completely just rocked my world. And I really wasn't expecting it. Um, that has been the biggest ripple effect in my life, is taking that class. It completely changed the direction of my career, my interests, what I value and hold dear, because we learned about it from an ethical perspective. If you were to apply different schools of thought
Hmm.
to not just decisions, but like just worldview, is what is the degradation of the environment ethical, and our actions that lead to it ethical, and do we have some kind of social responsibility to limit actions that would degrade the environment? And my answer was a resounding yes. Also, our professor was just so human. He took us out into nature one day, and that's where I learned the term more than human world, and I love that
Mm.
term
Love that term too.
because he's like,
Mhm.
these rocks are so old, and you know, like the grass beneath your feet is a living being. Um, but also there's things that are not living that are part of our world that also deserve care. Anyway,
Yeah.
taking that class like changed my life, and that's also when I learned the value of climate education. The last thing I want
Mhm.
to say about that class, though, is that's the first time that I really displayed climate emotions.
Mhm.
It was really because I was like super anxious about school at the time. That's kind of how it started. I was at office hours with him, and I was super anxious about like the demands of work and school. And then I
Mhm.
really started to connect the dots in my office hours with him. I'm like, yes, it's that, but also that all of this feels unimportant while I'm like currently learning that our world is like headed toward disaster.
Yeah.
And I had an actual like heavy breathing panic attack
Yeah.
in his office hours. And
Mhm.
he just is like, he calmed me down so much, and he was the first person who made me aware of these emotions are good because it means you care. And that's something we talk about a lot at Climate Mental Health Network, and that's part of all
Mhm.
our presentations, is that these
Yeah.
emotions are not useful because they're productive, because it's
Mhm.
certainly not productive to sit and
Mhm.
like sob your eyes out when you have a paper due in a day, but it is useful because it means that you have the capacity in your heart to be affected by this.
Yeah. It also, I mean, that catharsis, that release, like, kind of helps our system to keep on, going. But it's like, yeah, emotions are like energy in motion. And it's
Yes.
like, what do we do with that energy? Like, how does it move through us? And I mean, first of all, I think the universe put you in that class for a reason.
I think so
And
too.
and it sounds like the perfect professor to have a panic attack in front of.
Yeah,
So,
I think about him a lot, honestly. I think about him all the time and how I think there was another path where I
mhm.
either didn't take that class or I did and I didn't allow it to resonate with me or I didn't allow myself to exhibit that kind of vulnerability and I just, thought this sucks, that's awful, we need to do something about it and then just kept it moving. And I'm really glad that I didn't continue down that path.
Yeah, yeah. Thank goodness for the environmental ethics course. And when you were describing the class, I was thinking too how often I think we forget that we are living in a particular story and operate based on certain stories, and that this story is not capital T truth. That like
Mm,
there are so many stories and truths, and I think we don't even entertain what other stories can offer us, or how like our world would change if like we moved to a different story, because we forget that we are living in this particular story that tells us that certain beings are above others, that tells us what we're supposed to value and what we're supposed to produce and how, and that got me thinking about that too, that it's like so important to recognize what stories we're telling ourselves in our life, what stories we're hearing around climate and the environment, and how it's all originating from somewhere, and asking ourselves like, do our own values align with that story?
that's a really interesting point. And that reminds me of one of the the justice pieces that I mentioned before about the generational justice. And I think that this is one of the points that I love to discuss with people who are apathetic or perhaps are otherwise um, put into question the importance of caring about climate.
Hmm.
Um, I love to call attention to the fact that what the last 200 years have been is just that, is the last 200 years of planet Earth. And it's so arrogant of us to think that that is the only truth and that is the only we cannot possibly be so arrogant to like limit ourselves to couple of um, that couple of centuries. There have
Yeah.
been not only centuries prior of human beings and civilization on planet Earth that did not cause harm to the environment in the way that we have in the last 200 years, but of course, millennia of non-human beings on this, the billions of years of non-human beings on this planet. And
Yeah.
so, I think we really, really need to think about that like these last 200 years have been absolutely unprecedented in
Mm.
terms of damage to the environment. And we cannot defend that. We cannot defend that. And I think that that's really an important part of mine, is living as pre-industrially as you
Mhm.
can, even though that's so difficult. But that there are things like walking is pre-industrial, like like trying to do things in that way is what we owe this earth.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
controversial. No one wants to hear that, but I think that
yeah.
also rejecting convenience whenever
Hmm.
possible is also the least we can do.
Yeah. Well, it's like we've been taught this certain idea of what progress and development looks like.
Totally.
And, this idea of like moving forward, moving forward, moving forward. What does that even, what does that mean?
We need to reject the traditional view of it. We have to. Like, you just should not be using AI. Like, we need to reject that because there is a future where it does not harm the environment and use up as much energy as it does right now. But we're not there yet. So in the meantime, you need to just simply reject things. It's like reject, refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. You
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yep. Politics of refusal.
Yeah.
Mm,
Anyway,
I'm trying. It's hard to put into practice,
it's really hard.
but
Why wouldn't we do things that make our lives easier?
yeah, 100%. Well, and a lot of the making it easier is really these quick band-aid fixes. That's not really make it's giving the illusion of things being easier.
Yeah.
But then when you zoom out, you're like, hmm, it's actually maybe not the answer.
It causes us
Um,
harms for sure.
mhm. I like where we've landed on in this conversation. Going to the idea now of turning your anxiety and feelings around climate and all these issues into action, which is a rhetoric that I know we hear a lot, right? In climate spaces, especially talking to young people about how to like cope or navigate their feelings. A lot of times the response is this sort of action rhetoric, and here are ways to take action. And I know that we are both kind of interested in complicating that a little and critiquing that a little. Not to throw it out entirely. We're
Definitely.
not into binary thinking over here, but I would love your thoughts on why this kind of urge to like of action and productivity and immediately transforming our anxiety into action maybe isn't as empowering as we think.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. I love to talk about this, and you're totally right. Like, we're not into binary thinking. My colleague Larissa talks a lot about how research actually does show that people do feel alleviated after
Mhm.
engaging in some kind of action, especially collective action. So, the critique that I'm proposing here is that alleviation is potentially temporary
Mhm.
um, when it's understood as a single action
Mhm.
and also an individual action that you're not seeing results. Um, for example, the action that a lot of people were told was necessary of them was voting, but it
Mhm.
didn't work. We didn't get what we wanted. And even if we
Mhm.
did get what we wanted, it still wouldn't have been what we wanted.
Yeah.
So where does that leave people?
Mm.
Where does that leave people? And so I think it's really important to supplement these conversations of action with, you know, like specifically talking about what that means. Because on this point about productivity, also, it's like, turn your anxiety into something that's productive. And
Mhm.
what does productivity mean in that sense? You know how I was talking about that panic attack as not being productive in the
Mhm.
common understanding of the term, but it was useful for me.
Yeah.
So maybe finding something that's useful for you. Um, I just really take issue with the idea that what we should be doing is then continuing to participate on the hamster wheel by putting out resources, opportunities, participating in cleanups, um, and just band aid. It just feels like a band aid solution for
Mhm.
a really deeply rooted grief. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Could you imagine that there's a death in the family or something that causes you deep, deep grief, and someone says, "Okay, well, let's turn that grief into action. Like, let's go do something about it. That just doesn't feel right. That doesn't sit right. And I'm certainly not trying to equate, climate and with the grief that one would feel over a loved one. Not everybody feels it that way.
Hmm.
Some people might, but I think what I'm trying to say is that when grief is involved, when you're mourning the loss of wild lands and wild spaces that you have never known and will never know, like that's so deep in our human psyche. Um,
Yeah.
our connection to the physical land is everything, and the animals that roam it, and to each other. When you're grieving something that you can't even put into words, then how can you just turn it into action and call
Hmm.
it a day? This
Yeah.
action needs to be, like I was saying, rejecting, taking a deep,
Hmm.
like, transition into life, like rejecting the shackles that bind us, or like rejecting oppression when you have the opportunity.
Hmm.
Getting to know your neighbors. I know that's something that Rachel finds very important. Getting to know your neighbors and other people, and like building a circle of trust and community. Like, that's not one action. That's years and years of practice.
Hmm. Yeah. I was reading the book by Tori Choi called You're Not Alone, How to something like navigate climate anxiety. Um, and she was, talking about this idea of action and how it can be very singular and one-off and individual. And some of the actions that she, brought up were more aligned with mutual aid, neighborhood groups, communal centers, intentional friendships, which I love.
Yeah.
And then she asked, who do you spend time with? Who do you break bread with? Who do you challenge systems with? Who do you go to in times of need?
Interesting.
Like, and I wonder what it would be like if we spent times really thinking about those questions and acting on those questions rather than every 4 years feeling this frenetic call to vote and thinking that everything is suddenly going to change without having put in any of those nets and those just taken any of those steps to build something different in the in between time.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I really have to sit and think about that.
Mhm.
I think that our demand for immediate solutions is just totally unrealistic. And you're right, like every 4 years, I also think that one of my biggest frustrations with people my age and some of my friends is that they, or we, I'll say we, um, express deep dissatisfaction with the system,
Mhm.
will follow pages on Instagram about it, but won't actually truly do anything about it, or won't actually truly broach those conversations in an appropriate way with the people that you break bread with the people that you go to in a time of need. Because it feels like you're like infringing on something. Like we're not supposed to talk about those things. We're supposed to keep things light and airy. But that's not always that's not always productive or useful. Um, and I sometimes I can feel myself like I feel myself being a downer when I bring up conversations that I find truly important within in social spaces. And I wish I didn't feel that way. You know, I wish there were a handbook on how to engage in these kinds of open dialogues with the asterisk before that it's like, listen, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, and like that's not what the outcome of this situation needs to be. It's just
Hmm.
that like I'm trying to do that work that I think needs doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder because I've felt so similarly so many times of like, oh, like I can't bring up the thing because people have like so much on their plate already and like I don't want to make them feel guilty for being like entrenched in this system and asking them to change is like more work and effort, but it's like we're already working so hard and putting so much effort into a really toxic relationship. So it's like what if we just put that same amount of work and effort into a healthier relationship, a different story that actually, in the long run, is going to lead to so much care and well being and joy. And I do think the overwhelm of like the initial chaos and amount of work that that would be, I think can scare us from even wanting to start.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's like what's beyond that is so much better. Like it's such a better story. It's such a better experience.
I agree, and I also think it's important, as somebody, I used to work with high school students, and I love that age. But this generation of high school students is, dare I say, very different than past generations of high school students because for many reasons. Um, you could blame it on the pandemic, but you could also blame it on the world changing so rapidly in the last
Mhm.
15 to 20 years. Um, so I think I also don't like the orientation of we need to be positive, look for the positives. I like what
Mhm.
Tom Roderick says in his book, Teach for Climate Justice. He says, look for the helpers, which is also a very common, phrase. But I find that
Mhm.
to be a very helpful um, guide for high schoolers. I've heard them say some really, like, really awful things, some
Mhm.
really, really profoundly existential, negative, um, potentially clinical like things when it comes to climate.
Yeah.
And you know, perhaps in part it comes from wanting to say the most shocking thing for like gasps or laughs or just this nihilistic nothing matters, literally nothing matters, we're going to die anyway. And that's a rite of passage, like every young person probably has that phase. But when I'm encountered by that, like I'm never just going to be like, ah, no, like if we react that way when people talk about climate change as something that is an unstoppable force, we can't do anything, so we might as well do nothing. We, in my opinion, it's our responsibility as elders um,
Mhm.
to just stop that in its tracks and be like, hey, it's okay to care about this.
Yeah.
It's cool to care about this, and look for the people that are helping. Look for the people that are doing something, that are standing up against systems of oppression. Your teachers, your parents, perhaps. If it's not your teachers or parents, another young person in media, um, or maybe a character in a book or show. Like look for people that are helping, and there's plenty of people who outside of their 9 to 5s are dedicating their lives to making change, or being a pillar of their community, and you just you just can't lose sight of that.
Yeah. Who are not perfect and do not have all the answers,
No.
but are just as messy as and complex, but are helping find those cracks, you know. and seeing what can grow in those cracks, which is Bio Akomamafe, who I know we are big fans of, African thinker, philosopher, world shifter, um, talks a lot about this kind of American political neoliberal tendency to be like, we need to get that band-aid on, we need to restore, we need to get back to normal, right? Get back to normal. We saw that rhetoric a lot with COVID. And what he is saying and pointing us to is that maybe actually the healing begins when we sit with the wound and we go really deeply into the wound together, which I think relates to the toxic positivity and not wanting to like sugarcoat things for youth. Is like, no, we are living in a really wounded place and time, and how can we actually just be in this um wound together and have a human experience here, and really decide like what we want to heal towards, because we don't want to heal back to the way things are. Like, we want to create something new, like, right, like away from these current stories and algorithms. And yeah, and I think that's a really important way to look at things. It's like, what can, like, maybe let's take a pause before slapping that band-aid on and ask, like, what can come from actually being with the wound and letting that wound be open.
That's really beautiful. That's a really beautiful. I think that that also requires a certain degree of vulnerability
Yeah,
that
totally.
we need to exercise,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to encourage the people in our lives, and we need to create safe spaces for the people in our lives to be able to express that vulnerability to us, not to
Yeah.
mention on our end being able to express that vulnerability to others. And that's when you can really, sit in the wound. And so I had a conversation with actually one of the who is now a Gen Z advisor for Climate Mental Health Network. um, she hosts climate cafes, and I went to
Okay.
one of them, and we ended up talking for a long time. And I was bridging this topic of, man, I hate to be a downer, and she was like, I don't care if I'm a downer. I literally do not care. Like, I feel this way. I'm unapologetic about it, and I will attract the company that can handle it or feels this way as well. And I thought that was so radical and incredible. And I've thought a lot about it since she said that. And I expressed concern about being a downer, so it's not like I'm there yet. But I would love to work towards that so I can find that community of people who, I can be in this wound with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think being in the wound can also, it sounds kind of fun in a way too. Like, like it's
Like
kind
a
of,
relief.
yeah, it's a relief. It's kind of exciting to be like, what possibilities exist there,
Yeah.
if we go there together. But I agree, it's something I need to practice as well. And I think, there is a challenge of being in climate spaces that do really emphasize this idea of healing, that maybe is more so like, how do we heal to be able to keep moving through the system rather than real like systemic transformation.
Yeah.
That was like something else bio had talked about, was how this idea of like resilience can sometimes get in the way of transformation. And it reminded me of something you had said, which is like, what if we move towards freedom rather than empowerment? And I'm wondering, like, what is the difference between those two things for you? And
This. Oh
also,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, when you think about empowerment, like, where do you feel that in your body versus liberation? Is there like,
Hmm.
I'm trying to really deepen more into like an embodied somatic practice of climate emotion. So I'm just curious if you can kind of even like feel that difference in your body of where those things live.
This line of thinking comes from Bayo Kamafe, and I was profoundly shaken when I heard him say it. Because I've definitely been guilty of the from anxiety to action pipeline.
Hmm.
And I heard him talk about this at a conference, and I agree with his proposal here, because the idea of freedom means not that you've let go of the fact that this is going to happen, that climate
Hmm.
change is going to happen, that people are going to die, that, whatever the consequence of it is, and then you just continue to live in business as usual.
Hmm.
That's not what freedom means. It's not like freedom of responsibility. It's more like, for example, I view judgment of others in the climate space as one of our biggest obstacles. I feel it every single day when I see people doing individual actions that harm the environment. I feel it so deeply. I also feel it online, when I see, you know, people acting holier than thou. I'm like, well, wait a minute, but you, I see freedom as like finally getting to a place where you can honestly say that you have deepened your practice enough that you are not judgmental of other people and that it does not affect you and the way that you live. Um, that's the first thing. And I think that that is way more important than feeling like empowered to do something. It's more that
Mm.
you feel free and ready to engage with others, that you feel vulnerable, that you are that you feel safe in your own space, in your own head, and also in your wider society and community, in your family unit, um, and that you feel, it's kind of hard to put into words. Yeah, I'd say safety is key to this liberation. And then empowerment, I think, is not something to do away with, but this
Hmm.
idea of empowerment also aligns with this um, productivity that we were discussing earlier, that you're empowered to do something, you're empowered to um, to change a system. What if you were free and liberated to change a system and not empowered? I just think that's,
It's almost like empowerment feels like something you have to wait for, that's almost like bestowed via someone else,
yeah, like
maybe.
via someone else or society at large or your
Hmm.
age as well.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I feel like too, there's a lot of conversations, right, about like youth empowerment, especially empowering like youth climate activists have really been put on this pedestal. But then there's actually not the structures in place to support their own care
Man,
and
I
growth.
I did a whole talk about this because it feels like when I was in college is when the whole idea of being a change maker started, and like that was our
That's a
university's slogan.
very buzzword. Yes,
So
change makers.
buzzwordy. And still to this day, I mean, I've written so many college applications, not college applications, college recommendations for
Hmm.
students who have extremely long resumes, even though they're in high school. Um, the idea of being a change maker and being productive and feeling like I'm a youth activist still, which is like extra impressive because I'm a youth. What happens then when you're my age and you're like questionably youth, you know? Um,
You feel that?
I guess you're always like your activism is not less valuable. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, safeguarding youth mental health is really important. And when you're talking about empowering them, you're literally hold on, I'm gonna rewind a little bit. Empowerment could very easily lead to burnout
Hmm.
because empowerment assumes that you're riding on the high of your activism, of approval from others, of validation that what you're doing is working and that you're seeing change. If you work for an NGO, that you're you know achieving your deliverables, that you have these crazy metrics that you can demonstrate to a funder. um,
Yeah.
that's empowerment. That's empowering. But like, what happens when a wrench is thrown into things and you're no longer empowered and you're feeling actually really low because somebody got elected that you know is going to set things back decades, or you're not feeling so empowered because you go outside and you see how polluted the river nearby is, and you're like, wow, what I'm doing is not anything. That like I just don't think that that's a safe way to encourage youth to care and to be involved in this space. I think just that's why I think that freedom and liberation is just a much more beautiful place. The I go on the spiel all the time is the All About Love by Bell Hooks. The definition of love that she gets from The Road Less Traveled is um, when you love something, it's when you're spiritually intertwined, and that thing is spiritually intertwined with you. And that's, of course, relationships and people, but also the earth. And so I find that if your motivation for doing something or taking action is, that you want to be empowered, that you want to be productive, that you want to make a difference, you want to do stuff, that's fine. But then the layer beneath it should be, it's because I love this earth. I love the people that live on it. I love the land and the water and the
Hmm.
creatures and the stardust. I love it. I'm
Yeah.
spiritually intertwined with it, and it is spiritually intertwined with me. If that layer is not nurtured or even present, this layer is going to crack, and nothing is going to grow in that crack because this isn't there.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Oh, bell hooks.
I love her. I love that
I
book.
love her. Um, yeah, she also, just thinking about other works of bell hooks, describes the classroom as a place of messy possibility, coming back to where these like exploratory cracks are. And going back to climate education, I was thinking about all the potentials for putting into practice some of what we've talked about in the educational space.
Oh, there's great
But
potential. I just think we need to embolden educators,
yeah.
and we need to give them the freedom and possibility to move beyond, like, children should be allowed to wander and to play and have fun. And now it's just the demands are being put on to children younger and younger to be productive and to demonstrate productivity through achieving metrics that are
Hmm.
just, anyway.
Yeah. We're human beings, not human doings. That's what I tell people.
That's so beautiful. I love that.
Like, being is enough. And our stories around us tell us we're constantly not enough.
Right, and you'll do in the process of being.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, the two things that Tori Choi talks about in her book that we really need to move towards is degrowth, like you were talking about, and caregiving.
Yes.
These two things I think would really transform our relationships.
I think I would feel
So,
so much more at ease if I felt that I were um, working toward that rather
mhm,
than, something a little bit more concrete.
yeah, yeah, totally. Well, maybe we can end here for now and encourage people to think about what this means for your own life and how to do less, how to practice degrowth, how to be a better caregiver to those around, and also how to receive care. As I think those are two really important things that are going to help us help us move through this time that we're in.
Yeah, and also how to know when to stop or take a break when
Yeah,
something isn't working for you.
100%. Politics of refusal.
Yes,
As we mentioned a few
that was definitely
times.
a theme here. Yeah.
That was the theme.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Um,
thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this process, and I can't wait to see the final product.
yeah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think there's so many important pieces to reflect on. I know we could keep talking forever. And something you said that I'm going to be sitting with for a while is like the fact that I guess I'm like becoming or am an elder in the climate movement at this point. I'm like, wait, I'm no longer youth. Am I youth? I
Well,
don't
you're an
know.
elder or youth relative to,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
at all points in
yeah,
time.
yeah. And time and space is it's yeah. Sometimes I'm like I'm 10, but no, I'm actually close to 30. But anyways, thank you so much, Elisa. Really enjoyed
Thank
this.
you.
And we'll keep these conversations going. They're so
Absolutely.
important. All right.
Perfect.
Bye.
Bye.